Hey everybody, welcome back to Caveman Security. It's your host Robbie, and today we're going to go back through the OWASP Top 10. This time we're actually going to go over server-side request forgery, or SSRF. So just kind of bear with me as we try to go through it. So what is SSRF? So this is where we send an attack through a URL. So sometimes when you find an API request, you may see that there is a URL involved. In that case, this gives us a chance to maybe change it to another one like google.com or virus.com or whatever you decide. Okay, so what happens is the server will fetch it, and then the attacker controls where the server goes. So this is kind of touching more of the server side of this whole situation. That's why we call it SS, right? So here's like a simple analogy. So we have a trusted messenger in our tribe, think about caveman speak. So we say, go fetch the scroll, go fetch the tablet, whatever. The messenger says, okay, but the scroll is inside a forbidden cave, okay? So we are kind of sending this guy to his death, So this is something that I think is very dangerous, but it's something that we're doing, right? Same thing with our website. So if we're sending it to, let's say like, this is a virus.com, there's a high chance that we're going to have a big problem, right? All right, so let's talk about normal behavior. So when we're thinking about like functionality of like an API, we normally will think about uploading images by URL, import profile pictures, have webhooks, different things like this. These are normal behavior. These are things that are safe, right? But then we can take those safe ideas and turn them weaponized, right? So let's look at a dangerous request here. So we have our post API fetch image. Doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Kind of seems like a normal API. Now, what we get back as a response. So we see URL and then example.com cat PNG. Okay, this is the dangerous part, because now we can sit there and change this from example.com to this is a virus.com, and then maybe that image could have like a embed, or could have a virus, or whatever we want to think of. For me, as like someone who considers himself as a malware expert, I would say, okay, this cat PNG would maybe have a malware dropper, and then when you download it, that malware dropper will land in your host system, contact a server somewhere, and drop more malware, right? That's the scary part about this situation. So that's why we really shouldn't allow these URLs to change, but sometimes we do. Okay, so here's the attack. So here's just kind of something simple. They do attacker changes the URL. We're going to do localhost 5000 admin. Okay, so this is bad. We don't really want the local host to appear. This is something that we don't want. We want that to stay like in our staging environment. We never really want that in production, right? So the more that we can attack the local host, the worse we're at. Okay, so why this is dangerous? So if the server can reach things that you cannot, like internal services, localhost, cloud metadata, admin panels, this is a recipe for disaster. So we don't want this to happen. Okay, so remember, localhost problem. So remember, localhost means me. No one else can access this. But for your browser, that means that your machine is somewhere on the server and they can access it. We don't want that. Okay, this is dangerous. So again, cloud data. So we are thinking about the metadata problem. So some cloud environments, they actually access metadata services. So if they're able to go, oh, look at this, I found this localhost URL, I found this endpoint, and the attackers find that, then they can go ahead and start to do an enumeration process and see what they can find, right? So even though we're using the cloud and it seems safe, it's really not. Okay, so what makes this vulnerable? You may say, well, Robbie, this is not a big deal. What's the problem? So unfortunately, APIs trust a user-supplied URL. So again, if I have this request, I throw it into Kaido, Burp Suite, change the URL, and it gets accepted, then all of a sudden now, I can run into a different website, maybe someone else can run into a different website, and there's a problem, right? So we don't want people to run into this situation, okay? So here's a really good one for our API in the Wild series. So we can look at search.gov. So there was a server-side forgery request, and what had happened was they actually were able to take the server-side request and bypass all the mechanisms. Okay, and they got a pretty good bounty. They got $1,500 for it. Severity was medium, so pretty useful. So what happened? So search.gov had a functionality that allowed a user to submit URLs for processing. Okay, so whenever you're kind of looking for something, you had to process, maybe in the API request we could see a URL. That was their problem. Okay, so the application attempted to validate user-supplied URLs before fetching them. So it tried to validate, right? But obviously when the researcher found this, they were able to bypass that and force the server to make requests to unintended destinations. So in reality it was trying to do its job by validating, but somehow he was able to bypass that and the validation process did not take place. Okay, so why this matters? So, the attacker was able to make the request. They were able to take the URL and change it to something that could have been malicious. They were able to reach internal services, so obviously like admin panels, local hosts, whatever. So this was not great. And then they were able to access resources that were unavailable for external users. Okay, so remember, this is not supposed to happen. They're not supposed to access admin panels, local hosts, but they were. Okay, so the server was acting as a trusted proxy. So again, we have to be very careful with how our server is handling data and what information they're giving out to people, right? All right, so think about a better way to defend. So a lot of times we need to think about allow listing, maybe block internal IP ranges. We don't really want people to know our internal IP ranges at all. Okay, disable redirects. So we do not want to have redirects when we're using these types of functionalities. Obviously, we should validate DNS resolution, use network segmentation. I think that's important. And then, of course, limit server permissions. What can we see in the server, right? Okay, so here's just a good design rule. So only allow approved domains, not arbitrary ones. So we see some good approved domains here, images.cavemancoffee.local, okay, cdn.cavemanlocal.local. So it's okay. It's not malicious. If I was able to put in google.com or thisisavirus.com, okay, that's not great. So we want to keep that nice and safe. Okay, so key takeaways here. We want to make sure that the user cannot control the destination. We don't want them to take us somewhere that we don't want. We know that the server makes the requests. We know that the internal systems trust the server too much. It's not good. And the API returns useful data. So remember, this is kind of the bread and butter SSRF. It's pretty straightforward. I'm also trying to beat the time because I can only record 15-minute videos, but hopefully this kind of makes sense. Hopefully this is simplified enough, but it's educational enough that you understand. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at a demo. Let's go ahead and do this through the Crappy API. Okay. All right, here we are at the Crappy API. So let's kind of take a look at this and see what we can do. So the one way to invoke the SSRF in this particular web app is we need to contact a mechanic. So as you can see, this is kind of a repeating idea, but it's still very useful. So let's just go ahead and pick our mechanic. This time I'll choose Jamie or whatever their name is. Doesn't work. Please fix. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to send this request and we're going to see the API in action where we can see that URL actually appearing. So let's go ahead and find that. So I think it should be here, workshop mechanic. All right, so I'm going to highlight this again because, important. So let's take a look at this. So we see that we're at workshop, API mechanic, contact mechanic. Okay, so let's kind of look at the JSON request. We see our mechanic code, problem, VIN number, mechanic API. We see this URL. Okay, first off, we can see that it's reaching out to a different URL. This is not good. So this is our winning ticket, if you will. So let's go ahead and take this into replay. And let's just manipulate that. So the goal of the actual challenge for Crappy is we should be able to change this to google.com. So we're going to go HTTPS and we're going to do google.com. Now, maybe they want us to do HTTP, but what we're going to do is we're going to check it. So what should happen is I should be able to get this to be approved. If I get a 200 OK, that means that the server has accepted my input. Okay, so let's give it a try. All right, so it looks like it did do that. And if we look at the response, it's quite interesting. We can see that it's actually giving the metadata for Google, right? So I don't know if my preview will work, maybe not, but we can see that it is accepting the data for this. So now this is just google.com, okay? So this is the example of SSRF. Hopefully that kind of made sense, and hopefully you guys like this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one. All right, so thank you and take care.